Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with Matt Pinson, president of Welch College, to talk about his leadership lessons he's learned over 2 decades of presidential leadership. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of ABHE. And this is a special episode. It's actually one of ABHE's newest board members is my guest this week, and it's Matt Pinson. Matt is the president of Welch College, and he's been leading there in that position for over 20 years. And I mentioned that because we literally just got the most recent data from our annual institutional updates. For now, like 5 years in a row, the average length in a presidency has continued to drop. And now for ABHE presidents, it's at 7.2 years. So Matt, you have beat that threefold by being president at Welch. Some years, I wonder if it probably feels longer than a year. Maybe it's dog years or something. But it's definitely becoming rarer to see longer term presidents. And so that's why I've invited Matt in to just have a conversation around, his presidency, the lessons that he's learned over those 20 plus years. What would he do differently now that he has some experience and wisdom behind him? So been really looking forward to having this conversation. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you for having me on, Philip.
Absolutely. So our audience can get to know you a little bit. Let's start off with kind of a reflective question. Talk to us about a defining moment in your life or series of moments that kind of led you to the point of accepting the presidency of Welch College.
Well, when I was in graduate school at the University of West Florida, I was doing a history degree, a master's degree in history. I'm a part of the Free Will Baptist Church, and we have conferences or associations of congregations. And so I was active, even at that time, as a layman in my local association. I was selected to give a 10-minute devotion at the quarterly meeting of the association. I was 23 years old. I had led a camp already, a small little camp with like 75 kids for the association a week. And so after I finished that devotion, one of the little rural church deacons came up to me and said, "Matt, would you be willing to come to Shady Hill and give us that devotion this Sunday?" I drove way up into the country on a dirt road and gave this devotion at this little church called Shady Hill. And then he said, "Would you be willing to come back next week?" And so my devotion went from every week went from 10 minutes to 12 minutes to 15 minutes. And eventually I was giving these 18-minute devotions, they felt like sermons. And so after, a few months of that, he and the other deacons called me back in one of the Sunday school rooms. And I had given this devotion about the 90 and 9 and Jesus. I said, it's as though in your mind's eye, you could see Jesus taking this little sheep and putting it up on his shoulders. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into because the deacon said, "Matt, we want you to take us up on your shoulders, just like Jesus took that." So here I was at a secular university in a history program. And then somehow I got myself into this interim pastorate at this little country church. And I wanted to be a historian and a religious historian. I wanted to be a scholar, and I wanted to be a campus apologist. I mean, I had done apologetics at the University of West Florida and just was very involved with campus ministry there. I had an opportunity. I had a scholarship offer at Yale Divinity School. My wife was also a graduate student at Yale. That's where I met her. I also preached up there for 2 years at a couple of UCC churches up there. They were very responsive to, gospel ministry. And so here I was with 1 foot in academia and 1 foot in ministry, gospel ministry, preaching the Bible. And I really felt very called to both of those things. My wife was in sociology of religion. I was in history of Christianity and history of Christian thought. And so we both applied to PhD programs, and I got in 6 that she did not get into, and she got in 6 I did not get into. So my grandfather had this friend that had pastored a church down in South Georgia, about an hour's drive from Florida State University, where one of my favorite church historians was the head of the history department, but to which I had not applied for a PhD. And so I ended up pastoring this church and getting into the PhD. So it was a small bivocational church in a small town. One foot in both worlds. I ended up teaching at a community college for 7 or 8 years. I pastored for about 8 years. And I always just felt like something was missing. And I had gone to Welch College, which was then Free Will Baptist Bible College. My main spiritual and academic mentor was Leroy Forlines, who was like the senior theologian. He changed my life, and that experience changed my life. And so I always kind of had a sense that I would end up back at Welch, but I didn't dream it would be the presidency. When I got into my late 20s, I got a call that the former president was going to retire and would I consider putting my name in. And my wife and I laughed about it. I was 33 years old. I said, why would you want me? And I mean, because I thought, I would maybe be invited to become a professor or an instructor. But they said, well, we want a pastor of an actual Free Will Baptist church that's a typical Free Will Baptist church that's had growth. We want a young guy that can get out and get students here, and we need more students, and we want someone who's academic and who is a scholar. And so you fit that bill. And so I agreed to be interviewed, and I thought certainly I would get the job. Really, with me, it was kind of more of a season of my life where I had one foot in academia and in scholarship and in teaching and loving students. And then I had another foot very clearly in gospel ministry and Bible preaching and teaching. But I always had this sense that there's got to be a way to bring these two things together.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't thank God more for placing me here and for this is what I'm designed to do,
Yeah.
And in the best way I know how.
Yeah. I love how you express it too, that it wasn't that you were outside God's will, but you had there was an inconsistency that you were sensing as you're going through that. It's not quite fulfilled. There's something missing, and how all of that came together. I'm curious, back when you were 33 years old coming in as the new president, were you thinking that, you were going to be at Welch 20 plus years, or did you have different aspirations of that this might morph into something else, or you'll give it a shot for 5 years? Like, what was your mindset going into it?
It was a career.
Okay.
I had no intention of doing anything else.
How about that?
And a lot of that's because my church is the sponsor and is owns and operates Welch College. All of our trustees are elected by our denomination. I was brought up very strongly in support of the wider church outside of the local congregation and our conference, and the National Association of Free Will Baptists, which is our sponsoring denomination. I just believed that this was my calling and that God was placing me here for the long haul.
Wow, that's great. You took the presidency. You're 33 years old, which is a pretty young presidency. I'd say. I think I've heard of a couple that are in their early 30s, but typically it's not something until 40s, 50s, even 60s sometimes. How has your leadership perspective changed from when you were 33 years old to 20 plus years later to where you are? How have you approached leadership differently in those years?
I came into Welch very intimidated because of the people that had gone before me. I shouldn't say idolized, but I mean, I just held all these people in such high esteem. And so I was very, kind of frightened when I took the helm. But I also kind of felt like I had a pulse on what was wrong and what needed to be done. And that if we just did, a dozen good, solid revolutionary changes, that it would just all come together. Early in my presidency, there was one president that said, I knew more about what was wrong with that college the night before I became president than I ever have since, and how to fix it. And that's kind of the way it is with me. I mean, when you actually get there and you get in the seat of the presidency, you become humbled, and you see that things are not as easy as you thought they were to change. I think my biggest shift in my mindset of leadership has been from a revolutionary approach to leadership to an evolutionary approach to leadership. Of course, you're going to have to make revolutionary changes in some places, especially if you have to do a turnaround and you really need to jumpstart some things. There will have to be revolutions in certain places. A lot of times young leaders especially, they read these books about transformational leadership and they get stars in their eyes, and it's like, I've got to be a pervasive, transformational, revolutionary leader. And that's just usually not healthy. It usually doesn't work out that way, and it's usually not healthy to do that. And oftentimes it gets you off your mission. So that would be the biggest change that I've had since I was a young leader, is that I've become more patient. I've had to become more patient and realize that the best leadership that's healthiest for an organization, especially for a small Christian college, is usually evolutionary and building a context for change, creating a context, teaching, interpreting history, understanding and exegeting your institutional culture, and taking your time and putting the right people in place and not trying to force it and not making changes too quickly.
So many.
I've come to find out that that's a lot more healthy sometimes.
Yeah, so many that I've worked with and heard, and it's consistent with what I've engaged with other leaders on. Especially for whatever reason, for college president, there tends to be a draw towards what I have referred to, and in the literature calls it a romance of leadership. Like we're attracted to the highlights of what leadership brings. And like you said, going into it, you have all of the solutions. You see all the problems when you have all the solutions, until you actually do the work and find out, oh boy, this is really actually pretty layered, nuanced, and complex, that what seems like is the easy answer actually isn't. And you spend years trying to work out whatever those issues are. It's a good reminder for our young listeners who have the raw leadership skills and they're on a trajectory within their institutions, and they're learning. And I remember this as a young leader myself, looking at wherever I was and saying, oh man, if the president would just do this, everything would be fine. And then realizing, oh, wait a second, there's actually more to the story than I actually see.
It seems so simple at the time,
Yeah.
And then when you really get there, and you see how complex it is, it can blow your mind.
And some people can't make that transition. They actually go into it revolutionary, and in the process, they just kill themselves in the process of burn too many bridges and trying to make too many changes too fast.
And sometimes they set, it's not psychologically healthy to set such high expectations.
Yeah.
And a lot of times young leaders or new leaders that are in a new field like the presidency can really hold themselves to unrealistic expectations and drive themselves and work too hard and burn the candle at both ends, because they're driven by expectations that are really unrealistic for the institution that they're in. Yeah.
I'm curious what you would think, what your observations are. So I at the top of the show, I mentioned that the average length of presidency for ABHE institutions is 7.2 years. And we know from a national statistic, when you look at all sectors of higher education, that number actually is below 4 now. I think it's like 3.8 years. From somebody who's been in it over 20 years, why are we seeing so many presidential changes?
I think one of the reasons is because the presidency of an academic institution is a dance with your constituency, especially your internal constituency, like your faculty, that you don't have in other situations. That's one of the things about coming from the pastorate that's actually been kind of helpful to me, because if you lose the confidence of your faculty and if you lose the confidence of your staff, and there's this disconnect between the administration and the top leadership of an institution and the people that are on your team, you are going to hit rock bottom pretty quickly. Just even in my, anecdotal discussions with presidents that have left, a lot of times it's just you're trying too hard to do things so quickly, and your institutional culture and your team members, your faculty primarily, and then your staff, You're not creating a context for change. You're not bringing them along with you. And they see you as driving them rather than leading them. And I think that all too often, especially smaller Christian college presidents, they run afoul of the people they're leading because they're driving them too hard, and they don't have their trust. And it's all about success, and it's all about getting this place to a different place, and not about being sensitive to the people you're leading and that you're working with, that are your team, who make this institution what it is. So I think that's probably the biggest reason why people end up leaving so fast. They just get burnt out, and they get tired of not having success, and they end up making people dissatisfied with the pace of change that they're engaged in.
Yeah. And you know that the job is so complex that, when you're only there for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, it almost takes that long just to kind of get your bearings and sense of cycle of how things operate and build relationships. And trust is so much a big part of this, and you don't earn trust in a night, right? So it's
and you got to, and one of the things, Henry Mintzberg talked about the university as a professional bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And he said it's like a hospital. Mm-hmm. So you're dealing with faculty members, many of whom have PhDs, all of whom have advanced degrees. They're all experts in their fields. They are the professionals. And so you can't treat them like a business treats its employees, or even the way a lot of pastors treat the staff members of their church.
Yeah.
It's a different dynamic in higher education than you have in a lot of other industries. And a lot of presidents want to do it more like a typical industry.
Yeah.
And they want to drive it, and they want to pilot the ship, and they just don't get the trust and confidence of the people that are working for them.
Yeah.
They don't create that context for change and persuade people of the wisdom and the value of their vision.
Yeah. One of the benefits of you being in at one institution in the presidency for so long is that you can look back, and while I like to think that you've been a perfect leader in those 20 plus years, I'm sure there has been some mistakes made or things you wished you did differently. Maybe for those of us who golf, a mulligan, right? So if you had a do-over, if you had a mulligan, what would it be, and how would you have handled things differently?
When you're a young president or a new president, and you've got all these people that have been there for so many years, so much longer than you have, you just get a lot of advice, and you get a lot of pressure to do things.
Yeah, a lot of voices.
And there's pressure to hire certain people. And I just remember when I was a young president, when I was a new president, there were some people that I hired too quickly because there was a lot of pressure exerted to fill this position and to fill it with this person. My wife and I came up with a little phrase that it's easier to break off an engagement than to get a divorce. And so I think my biggest do-over would be some personnel kinds of things where I hired too quickly, where I didn't release a person quickly enough. I want people to work out. I want things to happen in my organization and in our organization that are good for my people. And I hope springs eternal, in the way I approach people and things and redemption and hope. And because of that, sometimes I waited too long to make a personnel change that needed to be made. There's sometimes people just aren't in sync with the institution. Maybe they were at one time, but they're not anymore. And sometimes that can become a toxic kind of situation. And if you're too soft and too reluctant to make personnel changes, it can really be rough on the organization and the other personnel who are doing so well and who are putting their best foot forward. And so I guess hiring too quickly and firing too slowly are the biggest do-overs that I would probably do in my presidency.
Yeah. And Christian nice kind of infiltrates us too often. And I, if we were to fault, I'd rather we were nice to people along the way. But the difficulty with that is we are slow to make some of those decisions that need to happen sooner, because it does create institutional drag. And I love the thing that you said, that a lot of people don't make this connection is that somebody at a certain point in the institution's history may have been hitting it out of the park and fit beautifully with the ethos and direction and role and responsibility. But things change over time. People change and institutions change. And what may have been a fit 10 years ago may not necessarily be a fit today. And I think that's a good lesson or an awareness, not only as you lead people and observe that in other people, but for you yourself. Sometimes you are no longer an institutional fit. And you may feel like, boy, things just aren't right. Things just seem off. I'm not able to contribute the way I used to. Well, that could very well be God's signal to you that you've moved beyond the institution, and that's not a bad thing. You kind of referenced this before in conversations with your wife, and I know that you have a fantastic relationship with your wife. Pull back a curtain a little bit. How has the presidency, the day-to-day grind, how has that impacted your personal life?
I read a book by Stephen Sample, who was president of USC, University of Southern California, called The Contrarian's Guide to Leadership. It was one of the first books I read after becoming president. He said that his biggest advisor was his wife. And he said, not everybody's spouse can be that or needs to be that. But in some cases, there are people who have spouses that can be a big advisor to their leadership. But he said, but you've got to build in boundaries, because if you make your whole life about that, especially if your wife does speak into the process, or if she works at the institution, it can just be a tough thing. Well, my wife was a stay-at-home mom for a number of years. We were able to avoid a lot of that because she didn't actually draw a paycheck for the institution. Now she works part-time for the institution. But even before she became a member of the staff at Welch, she was very active and very influential on the campus, and extremely influential in my own personal campus leadership. We just had to build in safeguards and keep reminding ourselves. And even now, it's like, okay, it's time to stop this conversation. We got to get back to talking about our personal lives. I can't just talk about the college all the time. And I've got to protect my time with my wife, and my time with my wife and my children, and my time with my children. If you have presidents that are in their 30s or 40s that still have children at home, I would just say be very careful, because you will never get that time back. Invite them into the life of the campus, but then also have times that have nothing to do with the campus and nothing to do with the college, where you are spending it just with your children and just with your wife, or just with your wife and children. And then, of course, have vacations. My first few years as president, my first several years as president, I didn't do that. And then I learned the hard way that I had to do it or I would burn out. And so,
those are some great words, and
family is what it's all about.
Yeah. And we talk about that, our family is priority, biblically, that's our first layer of ministry that we're responsible for, but yet we so rarely live it, and we allow career to kind of take over. Matt, this has been a fantastic conversation. A lot of young leaders, a lot of young listeners. Give us your top 3 words of advice to them as they're listening in today.
The first one is just don't go too fast. Don't get into the success syndrome. Don't think it all depends on you, and don't try to make all the changes at once. Evolutionary, not revolutionary. That will protect you. It will cause you to have a more healthy work-life balance and a more healthy approach to leadership, and it will help your institution. So don't be too fast. And the number 2 would be listen to the people around you. Surround yourself, especially your leadership team, with people you can trust wholeheartedly, who have your best interests at heart and the institution's best interests at heart, and who are smarter than you are. Surround yourself with those kind of people, and people who can hold you spiritually accountable and who pray for you. Surround yourself with those kind of people and listen to them. Don't have yes men and yes women. Listen to your leadership team. Hear what they say. Listen to it and pay careful attention to it, and have them hold you accountable and to pray for you. And this is the third thing. Though you listen to the people around you, whether it's your leadership team, your faculty, your staff, you're the leader. And you're going to have to be accountable and responsible for the decisions that are made. And your board is going to hold you accountable for that. They are not going to hold your leadership team accountable, and they're not going to hold your faculty and staff accountable. You are the one they're going to hold accountable. So don't be afraid to lead, and ask God to give you the grace to lead and to be a strong leader and not to be afraid. So that would be my 3 little tips.
Matt, that's gold right there. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day and for sharing your wisdom and your experiences.
Well, thank you, Philip. This has been a pleasure.
Absolutely. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.